Right now, as this story begins, Prince Harry is back in the UK. And this isn't a ceremonial visit. It isn't a wellness retreat. And it definitely isn't nostalgia. This is the same man who once publicly rejected the institution he now appears to be gravitating toward again. The same man who described royal life as unbearable. The same man who said silence was a weapon used against him, and then built an entire media career around breaking it. People don't return to places they once condemned unless something has fundamentally changed. And they certainly don't seek the protection of institutions they call toxic unless those institutions offer something no one else can. This isn't about reconciliation. It's about containment. Because when someone who spent years speaking freely suddenly seeks distance, privacy, and silence again, it usually means the conversation is no longer under their control, and that conversation has already started. Why the timing matters. This shift didn't happen in isolation. It coincides with renewed attention around long-dormant elite networks, resurfacing discussions, and legal proceedings that are no longer theoretical, but documented. Ghislaine Maxwell is serving a federal sentence. Her social power is gone. Her influence evaporated. And history shows something uncomfortable but consistent. When people lose everything, reputation, access, leverage, silence stops being valuable. That doesn't automatically mean explosive revelations, but it does mean conversations change tone. Behind closed doors, lawyers reassess, PR teams tighten. Old associations are reviewed with fresh eyes because testimony doesn't care about branding. It doesn't care about curated narratives. It only cares about timelines, proximity, and memory. And memory, unlike headlines, doesn't expire. How elite worlds actually work. To understand why proximity matters, you have to understand how elite ecosystems function. They aren't loud. They aren't public. They aren't documented in Instagram posts. They exist in private rooms, invitation-only spaces, and informal corridors of access, places where people aren't famous for what they do publicly, but for who they can reach privately. Clubs like Soho House have often been described, even by insiders, as connective tissue between industries. Entertainment, finance, politics, philanthropy. This doesn't imply wrongdoing. It implies overlap, and overlap matters because when worlds intersect, people remember who was present, not because they did something wrong, but because presence itself becomes contextual later. When the past gains context years ago, certain movements, events, and lifestyles didn't raise eyebrows. They didn't need to. Memory doesn't interrogate immediately. It archives. But once someone enters a role of global visibility, especially royalty, those archived observations are re-examined, not emotionally, logically. And that's when questions emerge. Not accusations. Why did certain paths cross? Why did access accelerate? Why were some details never explained because no one asked at the time? Institutions don't respond to questions by panicking. They respond by managing risk, and managing risk doesn't mean erasing the past. It means containing it. How royal systems handle complex histories isn't unprecedented. European royal families have repeatedly absorbed complicated personal histories, not by debating them publicly, but by neutralizing them institutionally. When something threatens stability, the priority is never exposure. It's equilibrium. That's why silence often isn't weakness in royal systems, it's policy. And once someone exits that system, they lose the insulation it quietly provides. Freedom brings opportunity, but it also removes buffers outside the institution. Narratives must survive on their own without centuries of structure holding them steady. Why this moment feels different, what makes this moment stand out, isn't one allegation, one name, or one headline. Its convergence, legal timelines, renewed scrutiny, elite recalibration, and a sudden geographic shift that suggests something has become unmanageable in its previous form. When a public figure who once rejected discretion begins to seek it again, that's not growth, that's strategy. And strategy usually appears when unpredictability enters the picture. Final thought: this isn't about proving guilt. It isn't about scandal, it's about understanding why silence suddenly feels safer than speech. And why returning to an institution once dismissed now looks like the only option left. Because in elite worlds, the most dangerous moment isn't when accusations are loud. It's when conversations go quiet and decisions start happening off camera. Asterisk. What happens next is where the story stops being about individuals and starts being about systems. Because once elite circles sense instability, they don't react emotionally, they reposition quietly. And that repositioning is already visible if you know where to look. Invitations slow, endorsements hesitate, allies go neutral, and silence replaces praise, not because something has been proven, but because uncertainty itself becomes a liability. Hollywood doesn't abandon people over rumors. It steps back when someone's presence introduces variables it can't control. And that's why the absence matters more than any headline. Because power doesn't announce rejection, it withdraws access. This is why Harry's return to the UK reads less like reconciliation and more like recalibration. A move back toward an institution designed to absorb risk, manage narratives, and neutralize historical complexity without public spectacle. Outside that system, every old connection must stand alone. Every past overlap must explain itself, and every unanswered question grows louder with time. While inside it, silence is institutional, distance is strategic, and protection is structural. The irony is unavoidable. Walking away was framed as freedom, but freedom came without insulation, and insulation is what elite worlds value most. When influence depends on trust rather than titles, even perceived unpredictability can be enough to cool relationships. Not because conclusions have been reached, but because conclusions are no longer necessary. At this level, power doesn't need proof. It needs comfort, and the moment comfort disappears, the room changes, the tone shifts, and doors that once opened effortlessly begin closing without explanation. Which is why this story isn't ending with an expose, a trial, or a confession, but with something far quieter and far more decisive: strategic distance, controlled silence, and a return to the only structure strong enough to hold a narrative together when the outside world starts asking questions no one wants to answer.